Today I'm showing you how to bake a no-knead sourdough pizza that you can make in a sheet pan. It's got a not too thick, not too thin crust, and you can use the same dough recipe that I showed you how to make last week in my no-knead sourdough bread video. Here's how to make this pizza. The night before you want to have your pizza, add 350 grams of water to a mixing bowl. Follow that with 10 grams of salt. I'm using kosher salt, but you can use sea salt as well. After that, you're going to need just 50 grams of active sourdough starter. This one I fed about 4 hours ago, and it's completely doubled in size. It's ready to use. So 50 grams of starter goes into the bowl. That's half the amount of starter that I use in my regular sourdough bread recipe. You need a little bit less starter for this no-knead pizza dough because it's going to need a long, slow, overnight bulk fermentation. After the starter, add 475 grams of bread flour. You can also use a mixture of all-purpose and bread flour if you want to use both. Mix the dough together really well with a spoon, a dough whisk, or a bowl scraper, something like that. You're not going to do any kneading for this dough, no stretch and folds, no slap and folds, nothing like that. So make sure you mix the dough together really well so there aren't any dry bits of flour left. And once your dough looks like this, that is all you need to do for the next 10 hours. Go ahead and cover up your dough and let it rest overnight for about 10 to 12 hours at room temperature. The next day, your dough should be puffy and doubled in size, looking something like this. You see my dough fully doubled in size. It's got a little dryness on top because I covered it with a kitchen towel instead of something airtight. If you want to avoid that dryness, cover your bowl with plastic wrap or let the dough rise overnight in a bowl with an airtight lid. So the next morning, you're going to take your dough and transfer it onto a metal sheet pan or a cookie sheet. This is technically a 17-inch by 11-inch one. Use the same size pan as me if you want similar results, but use whatever pan you have. Pour a few tablespoons of olive oil on the pan. That's going to create a non-stick layer between the pan and the dough, and it's also going to give the bottom of the dough a nice crispy crust when you bake it. Now, try to release the dough from the bowl without deflating too much of the air out of the dough. Once you've got it out of the bowl, pop it onto the sheet pan right on top of that olive oil. And the name of the game here is to just shape it into a long rectangle. You're basically trying to mimic the shape of the pan. It is not going to be able to stretch completely to the edges right now without deflating too much of the air. So just get it roughly the same shape as the pan. Then during the proofing process, the dough will rise and the gluten will relax, and you can help the dough reach the edges of the pan later. If you accidentally tear a hole in your dough like I did here, just stretch another piece of dough next to it and press it down on top of the hole. That should patch it up nicely. Once your dough is roughly the shape of the pan you're using, it doesn't need to reach the edges of the pan yet, that's okay. It's time to cover up the dough. You definitely want to cover it up in an airtight way so it doesn't dry out. So I like to add some oil to a few sheets of plastic wrap, then place that plastic wrap on top of the dough so it covers the whole thing. So the plastic will keep air from drying out the dough, and the oil will keep the plastic from sticking to the dough. Now it's time to let this dough proof or go through its second rise. You can just let the dough rise at room temperature on your counter for about 2.5 hours or until it just about doubles in size. Here's my dough after 2.5 hours. It was fairly puffy and I knew I would be able to stretch it out to reach the edges of the pan. If you want to, you can top and bake your pizza dough right now, but if you have a few hours till lunch, feel free to put this in the fridge like I'm doing. It'll happily sit in the fridge for a couple hours. It won't overproof. It is sourdough after all. A half hour before you want to bake your pizza, preheat your oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Then pull your dough out of the fridge. My dough is looking nice, really well fermented at this point. It's definitely not necessary, but I'm glad I gave it a few extra hours in the fridge. Go ahead and unwrap your pizza dough, get your fingers a little bit slick from the olive oil, then stretch the four corners of the dough out to meet the edges of the pan. If any holes pop up in the dough, like happened to me, you can just pull a little bit of extra dough and press it down into the hole. There's almost nothing you can't fix. This is a really easygoing type of pizza. Then just dimple your fingers into the dough, stretching the dough out even further into the edges of the pan. And after just one pass through with dimples and another patch on that hole, my dough is looking good and ready to top. Now, this isn't any specific style of pizza, so you can top it with whatever you want. There really are no rules unless you want there to be rules. So I'm topping mine with 6 spoonfuls of San Marzano tomatoes that I crushed in the can. Then after that, I added 160 grams of shredded low moisture mozzarella cheese, and I only measured it just so I could tell you how much it was. Usually I just go by eye. Then I added a sprinkling of Parmesan cheese and some red pepper flakes or chili flakes just because I like those, but this is definitely optional. Then I topped this with just a whole load of pepperonis because in my last pizza video, some people told me it wasn't enough pepperonis. So I loaded this bad boy up and then it was off to the oven. Make sure your oven is preheated to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Put your pizza on the middle rack. Go ahead and set your timer for 20 minutes. You might need to bake this a little bit longer or for a little bit less time depending on how the pizza is looking. So stay near the oven. I think for this type of pizza, when it starts to look like this where the cheese is bubbling on top and browning, it's time to pull it out. This happened at around 18 minutes for me, but around 20 minutes seems to be a good number to shoot for. When you take your pizza out, it should look something like this. It'll be really well cooked and should have a crispy bottom. You can just cut this into slices right there in the pan, but if you want to maintain that crispy bottom on the pizza, I recommend you take it out with a couple of spatulas and put it onto a wire rack. The wire rack will allow airflow to go under the pizza. That will allow steam to escape the pizza, and you'll avoid that soggy bottom that sometimes happens with homemade pizza. Now this part is completely optional, but I decided to top my pizza with a little finish of basil leaves. I love the flavor of basil, and I thought the green would look cool next to the pepperoni. If you're a fan of pizza crust that isn't too thick, but also it's not too thin, you're gonna love this pizza. It's not near as thick and bready as Detroit-style pizza crust, but it's not really thin like cracker-thin tavern-style pizza either, so it's a good middle ground. I've got bad news about this pizza though. If you're a fan of frozen pizza from the store, you're really not gonna like this pizza. It just tastes too good. Seriously, the flavor of this dough is amazing. If you like homemade bread, you like sourdough bread, you're gonna love this pizza. This dough is the perfect mix of chewy and crispy. The olive oil in the pan almost fried the dough from underneath, so it gave it that focaccia-like browning effect on the bottom. To show you how crispy it was, I did the thing YouTubers love to do. Definitely crispy. Since I love focaccia, I really liked this style of pizza. I've made focaccia and Detroit-style pizza before. Both of those recipes are actually in my ebook. Those recipes are great and I highly recommend making them, but I really wanted to try a pizza recipe with an absolutely no-knead dough like this one, just to show you that this dough isn't lacking anything. It just gives you a different style of pizza dough. If you want to make this pizza, you can find the ingredient amounts in the video description below. Subscribe to Grant Bakes for more sourdough related videos if you haven't subscribed already. I will see you in the next video.